Okay. And so, just to recap, as we're talking about community, there are so many different layers that we want to be thoughtful of. We want to be thoughtful of the individual and how they're connected to other individuals within that community, and that connection to the place and the culture over generational time and also physical space. And to be thoughtful of the constructs that impact all of those different variables and how they might move a community forward towards strength and resilience, but also how they might impede a community's ability to have strength, resilience, autonomy, so on and so forth. And so we're going to consider that in our discussions today. So as we talk about community, as each individual, we might start to consider and pick apart the different communities that we're part of, right? So oftentimes we'll just kind of have this primary identity or community with which we really thoughtfully engage, right? But also to consider the many layers of community that are constantly with us and thinking about how we engage on an individual level with those that are directly around us, maybe their friends, maybe their family, but also the situated communities in which we are just kind of by place, right? So the neighborhood that I'm in, the school that I go to, the streets that I walk by, the different shops that I choose to frequent, or maybe just frequent because they're convenient, right? And start to kind of think about those different layers. Because when we talk about resilience, connections that are direct, also networks that are built more broadly, both of those are important when we're talking about building strength and resilience within community, right? So I'm just going to let folks unpack a little bit in a personal space for a minute or two, some of the different communities that they are aware of, and then think maybe about some of the communities that you are a part of, even if they're kind of outside of your awareness. And then we'll share. Okay, folks, so feel free to just send in the chat layers of the community that came to you in that discussion, particularly if they're parts of the community that you maybe hadn't initially thought of when I posed this question. And one example that comes to mind is, for example, yesterday we had voting, which was relevant to many of us, but maybe some of us chose or some of us didn't choose to be part of that. So that community, that political system still impacts us and we're part of it, whether or not we chose to participate. And so that's an example of community layers that are kind of tied to our existence and our resilience, that we sometimes are more aware of or not more aware of. Okay. And so being thoughtful of that is important. But also, as we consider those different layers of community, always considering the outside structures that impact the communities in which we fall and being and acknowledging that, right? So, for example, we have strongly racialized kind of community building and development in this particular country, right? And so, where folks were or were not able to build community leads generationally into where their community might be at this moment, right? There is a website here called The Lines That Shape Our City that run through some of the activities, some of even just the terms that we use for different neighborhoods or different areas, and how those have a political or they have legislative kind of relevance historically, right? And so considering that and being thoughtful of that is really important when it comes to intersectionality and where we exist in our current communities. Okay. Similar for gentrification, and this is really relevant to the sustainability discussion, right? Because as cities are um, upgraded to be more resilient to things like earthquakes, more walkable, more sustainable, more connected to local food systems. That process has to be really thoughtful so that the transition is just and it doesn't exclude folks that have historically already been excluded from strong and resilient community building within the structures. Of course, there's strong and resilient community building that happens outside of traditional structures, right? But within the political structures in which we exist. Um, and so being thoughtful of that as we have the very discussion of sustainability is so essential. I think one of the most common themes that has come up in reflections and quizzes in this class is that a lot of what we perceive as steps to bring us to a more sustainable individual and community system feel like they're too expensive, right? There is a price tag on them. They exist within a capitalistic society. And that means that it's part of those structures that have historically excluded folks over generational time. And so one of the things that we'll do today is consider how we can challenge that, how can we can look to communities that have already had to build resilience outside of some of those traditional structures, and how we can move forward in kind of engaging as communities at the grassroots level without having to kind of exist within those price tags potentially. Now, there will be a lot that we can't cover as well. So we're gonna I try to include some resources within the PowerPoint so you guys can each kind of engage in the parts that speak to you as well. Okay. So let's engage with this idea a little bit more. We've talked about community. And we kind of have our ideas about what community might be, but there's another term that's also used within kind of the research realm or kind of the academic realm, which is called social capital. So, thoughts on what social capital is? Essentially, an embodiment of a variable related to community. What does that mean? What is social capital? And there are issues with the term. I will put that out there.
Would social capital be like certain privileges we have, like how, I mean, like capital, I don't know, I think like popular kids in high school have more like social capital than the less popular kids, like, and then as adults, it kind of like your privileges translate to like status
Okay. Okay.
to some
Yeah.
people.
The privileges that you hold within your communities. Okay. Other thoughts?
I kind of remember this from a sociology course I took a long time ago, and it's the idea that like someone has sort of an in with a certain community somehow, like they can speak a certain language or they dress a certain way, so they are kind of given access to certain communities. I think
Hmm.
that's what I remember.
Yeah, so it's the embodiment of all of the different networks and points of connection that a person holds or a community holds, right? And those forces are structured by the political structure, by the systems around them. And so within social capital, there is some autonomy. Like Gideon had talked about earlier about choosing your friends, for example. There's also aspects of social capital that are based on circumstance or really pushed by the institutions in which you exist. And so we will use social capital a little bit in our discussion of community, and it is a variable or a term that is used to kind of quantify community within academic literature and research. But we want to be thoughtful that within the term social capital, there is some autonomy and there is a lot of forces from kind of institutions that already exist, right? And so, what are the family networks? What are the support systems? What are the access to resources, both physical resources, but also social resources? What is the person's ability to engage in those systems, right? Ability to vote, ability to engage in making changes within their community, ability to engage with the social political systems within their community. I just got back from an illumination project presentation on the Cascade campus. Folks know what the illumination project is? Anyone? Okay. So I think there was a student in class who actually had some experience. Try to remember. Um, I think that student is not it's not here today, but the Theater of the Oppressed, right? And so it's a project that PCC has been doing since I was a student here at PCC, where they have students come into the program and they pick a theme in terms of isms. So the focus is racism and xenophobia this year. And the students discuss and learn about racism and xenophobia throughout the whole year. And through their own experiences of the students in the program, develop theater that expresses some of those nuances, right? So it's not these big, like microaggressions, oftentimes that we think of. It's a combination of these minor, different types of nuances that we experience within community and our privilege. The way that the theater works is that there's a 15-minute theater that runs, or play that runs, and then the audience, then it runs a second time, and the audience actually interjects and says, okay, stop. We're going to stop the play right now. And the audience will take the place of various actors within the show and make changes. It's a way of practicing standing up, speaking out, making a difference in community because there are discussions. Sometimes someone will enact a change that takes autonomy away from someone who's targeted within the play, and we'll have a discussion around that. Sometimes folks will enact a change that gives the audience tools about how to make those changes. And so it's kind of a brave and safe space to engage in community building and change making and learning around the impacts within our communities of various folks, right? And one of the things that was mentioned in the session is when you stand up and take someone's place, make sure that you share some sort of identity with that person so that you know and can inform and engage with their conflict, right? Rather than trying to represent yourself as someone else's identity and try to solve their problem. And so it's a very interesting type of civic engagement in where spaces are created so that folks can practice community building and practice really deep and difficult discussions in a thoughtful and engaging space. It's called the Illumination Project, and I will try to remember to send out the rest of their dates. Hopefully, there's a couple more. Oh, wait. I have their booklet here. Try to remember to send out some more information about the project. Yes. So they have a performance on the 22nd, 27th, 28th, and 29th. Yeah, there's four more this term. Um, and so this is a way of engaging some of these layers and these kind of intersectionality and community that come up when we talk about building resilient communities or we talk about building social capital within specific communities and areas. Okay. And so we had kind of engaged with some of these factors here, talking about social capital, being the strength of one's connections and networks. This is really important because it's correlated with a number of different positive outcomes. Like when we use social capital as a variable, we see that it's correlated with a number of positive outcomes. So, as community builders, as individuals interested in a more sustainable world, we need to be thoughtful of how we can build community or increase social capital, however you kind of name it. This includes factors like diverse connections, strength and social cohesion, the ability to engage in civic engagement, right? And also the implementation of civic engagement. And then having connections outside of just a specific or individual locality. So within social capital, you can talk about folks being connected between and within one specific locality as called bonding social capital, but also that community being connected to outside resources tends to make those folks and those communities more resilient in what's called networking social capital, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because oftentimes we can, engage within community and have resilient community, but communities don't exist within themselves or on their own. And in an increasingly globalized world, we really rely on outside networks and forces and communities. And so building strong connections between communities is also really essential to building that social capital. Um, and so having strong bonding social capital and having strong networking social capital leads to more resilience and adaptability and adaptations in the face of change. And when we're talking about sustainability, oftentimes we're talking about sustainability within the face of global change from climate change, for example, right? And when we think of impacts of climate change, we will see changes. We'll see environmental changes. We'll see social changes. We'll see economic changes as our world responds to the impacts of climate change. And so it is essential always to come back to community, right? There are many things that we can do to make our lives more sustainable in terms of saving water, which we've talked about, in terms of environmental impact, in terms of the impact with food. But within the face of these large globalized changes that we expect and anticipate because of climate change and global warming, really at its essence, all of those things, water, food, so on and so forth, are solved within community. And so the stronger the communities that we can build internally and the more connected we can be between communities that are diverse or different in terms of their location, the more resilient we will be globally in the face of these impacts and changes. And so we're using some terms. Let's engage those terms a little bit. Resilience being the ability to recover from or adjust to changes, essentially, right? So I often think of like a bungee cord spider web, right? So as changes kind of push and ebb and flow, the stronger that spider web is, and the stronger those connections are, not made of thin f spider thread, but of bungee cord or something even stronger, then the more that community will be able to adjust. Also, I've heard the cultural reference to Shemat. Uh, Palm trees, right? Palm trees being able to bend in the face of the wind as it comes and flows or changes, being able to withstand drought, for example, for a little bit, but then kind of re-engage once water comes through. So being flexible without breaking, like a palm tree or like a bungee cord spider web, right? These analogies of being able to adapt when change happens, but also always considering and being honest that those structures that are built up that we can be flexible with, that palm tree or that spider web, they're built based on the systems that we have. And so considering equity, considering the fairness or justice in the way that people are treated and the way that the folks have access to actually building up those structures of resilience, of adaptability in the first place, and being honest about that in our transition to a sustainable world. To get those two pieces to merge, resilience and equity, we really have to have a participatory and diverse design, right? So if you have a global system where all of us are relying on one another, then for a system to be more resilient and kind of move forward to a more sustainable future, then you have to engage all of those stakeholders that are involved. Or otherwise, and we've seen this happen, you will see the system evolve to benefit a smaller and smaller group of people that are already represented in that decision making and exclude a growing number of people that have been historically excluded from that decision making, which means that certain communities will continue to get more and more resilient, but the majority of us will continue to be hit with factors, disruptions, so on and so forth, that decrease our ability and autonomy to be more resilient, right? So really being honest in that discussion and thoughtful of that as we're talking about ways that we can engage in community and ways that we can develop resilience is really important. And I believe next week, we have a short audio on a just transition. I would really recommend that you look more into that idea, a just transition, and how globally we can make sustainable change without leaving folks behind in those discussions and applications. Okay. Any thoughts or questions or comments so far? Okay, feel free to jump in if you do. So some foundational principles for building community and resilience. Now, I don't love that there's only six. I feel like we can just like, let's see, just take out the six. How about that? Because there's so many more, right? But this kind of gives us a way of thinking about how we can build community, how we can build social capital, we can build resilience. Is thinking about the people and the networks that are involved, right? It is essential that when we say people, we are talking about a diverse group of folks. And I say that not because it's important to talk about diversity and equity in kind of like this fluffy way. It's actually very egocentric and self-benefiting, right? Because if I'm in a situation where I'm in a community that needs to be resilient in the face of a change, a disaster that's happening, or rise in sea level, or global warming, then I need to exist within a community with a diverse skill set, or otherwise, me as an individual, I will not be adaptable. I will not be resilient to those changes. And so we absolutely have to, within a sustainable outlook and future, rely on a diverse community, a diverse group of folks, because those folks come in with knowledge and skill sets that allow all of us to be more resilient, right? And I hate to put it in that way, very egocentric almost, right? But it is really essential to know that this beyond just being in community, um, beyond just being in community and being inclusive, and a lot of the really kind of surface level words that oftentimes are used to talk about community, it is for our own benefit that we have to exist within diverse communities. We absolutely have to. We have to be able to rely on one another because I can only have so many skill sets and I can only have so many privileges and I can only have so many stories in the face of change, in the face of global warming, disaster, so on and so forth. I really have to be able to reach out to those around me with diverse skill sets. And that again brings us to systems thinking, right? Because we exist within systems, these feedback loops, and as we're trying to move towards a more sustainable future, as we're trying to build communities, we have to engage and acknowledge those systems in a really real way, right? So think about how we can support those feedback loops and amplify positive change so that starts with people, it starts with place, it starts with culture. All of these things have to be layered on within a systems thinking approach. Thinking about how we might change an economic system at a local level that might impact broader communities or global communities and make positive change, but really engaging the system rather than the symptoms. And oftentimes, when we talk about sustainability or we talk about making change within community, we really do engage in symptoms. And that does make a temporary change, right? But really to get long lasting, um, truly resilient change, we have to engage in system thinking when we're talking about building resilient communities. Thinking about adaptability and transformability. Now, this goes back to the two things that we already mentioned. For us to experience change, we have to also be able to change ourselves. We also, as a community, have to be able to change the way that we engage in resource extraction, for example. Acknowledge that we are using too much water too quickly. Acknowledge that we're using too much phosphorus and nitrogen too liberally, right? And make changes. So that adaptability and transformability, being able to transform our engagement with those resources is essential. And it goes back to making sure that our community systems, our political systems, our economic systems are built on a diverse set of skills and knowledge so that in the face of change, we can make those changes instead of them being really siloed in a way where they're kind of out of reach of change. They're kind of out of reach of adaptability. And therefore, communities will continue to be impacted by them, even as they see the necessity and the requirement for change for a sustainable future, right? And I think we engaged in this idea of sustainability in that discussion here. And so coming back to something that I believe Scotty brought up, really having the courage to build community. And actually, not just Scotty, lots of folks in the room talking about having the courage, having the patience to engage in community um, so that we have all of these things: diverse people, thoughtful systems, adaptable, transformable, and sustainable futures. We also have to take the time to engage in community. We have to take the courage. It's not easy. It's not easy to have difficult discussions. You know, in that room that I just came from, the Illumination Project, there were tears. And there have to be for us to make positive change. We have to be courageous. We have to be able to really sit with each other and see each other and be able to be patient in change. Um, a lot of change makers can sometimes get caught in the immediacy of wanting to see change. And that's just human nature, right? But if we can be courageous in the way we engage with one another and we can be patient in the way that we expect change, then we can make long-term change that we might not see, but will have a greater impact, right? And so I include this video here on having courageous discussions. Sometimes we talk about creating safe spaces, but this video encourages us to create brave spaces, right? Where instead of safety and just kind of like maybe potentially ignoring certain really important topics so that everyone in the room feels comfortable, instead we can engage all of the topics, but make sure everyone is respected within that difficult space. Um, One of the books that I would recommend on specifically looking at thinking through racialized trauma, and that's really important to many of our cultures, particularly here where we are, is My Grandmother's Hands. Just a way of kind of thinking about how each of us can think through our own privilege instead of asking other folks to always advise us or engage us, and how we can think through our own privilege and move forward in our own healing and then our community building as well. Okay, and I'm sure there's so many other resources too, but I'm just putting a couple here and there, and you're welcome to engage also feel free to add, so on and so forth. I'm just gonna check the chat really here. I see something come in, and I welcome you all to look too. Yes. Yeah. If you're imagining changes you'll see in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. I love that. I really appreciate that. Um, and so this class is about individual sustainability, but as individuals, we are pressure points and we matter. And so that's so important because we have a story and we have a voice and we have an impact. And so as we make the little changes all together, we will make a more beautiful, a more sustainable, a more resilient future together. Okay. Um, I want us to consider, we did have a resource around climate migration and refugees. I want us to pause here. Well, actually, before we do that, any thoughts or questions? Because we're gonna like take a moment with climate migration and refugees. Okay. It's really essential as we're talking about climate change to be really thoughtful about the real inequitable human impact of climate change and also sometimes of the steps that we take to become more sustainable, right? And so thinking about the structures with which we use to solve the problems we have created, if they are very similar, then they will become feedback loops of one another. And so oftentimes when we talk about sustainability, we talk about decreasing carbon input, so on and so forth. Um, Sometimes we reinforce inequities and we end up kind of penalizing folks around the world who have not really generated this climate crisis, right? And those folks will continue to kind of feel the brunt of global warming, climate change, so on and so forth. And being really thoughtful about how that impacts folks, and how that impacts their ability to exist within community. And that's really the key point, right? Because when folks are continually being exposed to stressors or disasters or changes in weather patterns, changes in drought and ability to access or grow their own food, so on and so forth, then they are continually being uprooted from those uh, bonding, what do we go? Bonding social capital and networking social capital, and they're continually uprooted. And so being thoughtful about that, how that impacts folks is really important. Um, Thinking about how folks respond to disasters that are kind of acute, but also thinking about how folks respond to chronic changes within the climate, chronic changes within kind of global economic and political systems is also really important, and how those changes that come about because of climate change amplify other types of conflicts, right? Amplify economic conflict, amplify political conflict, amplify violent co- and other types of conflict around the world. And how those folks at multiple intersectionalities will oftentimes and historically have always felt the brunt of changes to the climate, changes to global warming, so on and so forth. So, what does this mean, intersectionalities? Who knows? Just so we make sure we define our terms.
It's like different points of identity, right? Like someone's ethnicity and their sexual orientation and if they're trans or not, gender, all that kind of stuff.
Right, right. And so folks that have intersectionality, multiple different intersectionalities, well, all of us have multiple different intersectionalities, right? And so some of those are privileges, and some of those within certain situations might put us at risk, right? And so thinking about those privileges and those risks and how particularly risks accumulate for folks, right? So thinking about somebody who has a minority identity, is also female in their gender, a mother, for example, somebody who is, a refugee, immigrant, and how those layer on the risks and their ability to create networks and community that are local and that are broader, right? When we have these discussions. And so the climate and climate change will continue to impact folks in many ways. And we will see folks that are not able to sustain their physical community connections as easily. We already are at a point where an estimated 20 to 30 million displacements happen every year because of climate change. Now, just to note, this number includes sometimes the same person being displaced multiple times. And those displacements oftentimes, and more often than not, are actually within country boundaries. And many of these people are able to go back to their homes, right? And so there's a lot of nuance in these numbers, and that's really important because it's so very hard to define what a climate migrant is and what a climate refugee is. Also, just noting that there's a lot of baggage right now politically associated with with the words immigrant, migrant, refugee. And so having these conversations in a way where those are not exacerbated in a negative way and instead lead to community building is really important. There are, because of all of those nuances, there's a really wide range in the estimates of who all is going to be moving around because of all the climate changes that we expect. All the way from 100 million to 1.5 billion. And the reasons is because there's so many different intersections, right? There are people that move because over decades they have not been able to sustain or feed their families. And maybe that is because of drought, because of climate change, so on and so forth, right? And so depending on how you include direct and indirect variables and who you consider a migrant or a refugee, folks that are moving within country boundaries versus folks that are moving between country boundaries. And know that because of what we just mentioned with that politically laden kind of terminology around refugee and immigrant, oftentimes the focus is folks that are moving outside of country or political boundaries, but that doesn't necessarily actually capture the majority of the folks that are impacted by climate change. Because the majority of the folks that are impacted by climate change, first, they are displaced internally, then they are displaced externally, right? And so if we can consider those folks that are being displaced internally and give them the resources to build community so that they can stay in place, then they will not become, or they might not become, folks that are displaced externally. And so really being thoughtful about the terminology, the way that we collect data, the way that we communicate this particular issue is so, so important within this particular political climate. This piece here, not everyone who's impacted moves. There are folks there's actually a term called trapped communities that are not able to move. And there are folks that are not willing to move because that's home, right? And so you will have folks that want to retain the autonomy and the choice to stay home, even if there are rising sea levels, even if there is increased air pollution, even if there are increased temperatures, because that is home. And we'll get to this in a minute, or we can just go there now and then come back. Is equity, climate equity, is a place in which folks have the ability to choose whether to build community in their same locality or to move to another locality, right? They have the ability, they have the equity, and they have what they need to make that choice, and either or could work, right? Um, and so thinking about that is important. A couple books and podcasts I want to recommend. Changing Climate, Changing Migration podcast has just a number of episodes where they go into a very academic discussion of climate change and its impact on human mobility. Okay. This is a novel, but it's based on the really, really difficult situation that happened in Syria. And so historically, that is just a really, really overwhelming example of how droughts led to impacts in the food supply chain, led to really, really intense, awful social unrest. And this book doesn't focus on all of that, but it does tell a human story around that. And so I think that that's a kind of an example that is important and pertinent to our discussion. Also, Radiance of Tomorrow, I will say both of these books, particularly this one, they're not easy reads. I'm just going to put that out there. They're really difficult reads, particularly this one. But Radiance of Tomorrow focuses, it's also a novel, but it focuses on a hypothetical community in Africa that is displaced because of resource exploitation and had already previously been impacted by civil war. So these layers of intersectionality and how they impact community connections and engagement. And so another resource potentially if folks are interested. Okay, we covered this. Um, those are big themes, right? And we've talked about a lot of kind of big concepts and big impacts, but we want to bring it back to what you and I can do today now, right? What are some of the ways that we can build community? And if each of us is building stronger, more diverse, more resilient communities on which we can rely to be more adaptable and more transformable and more sustainable, then globally we will see that impact, right? And so if folks have thoughts on this question here, what are some ways that you could build community in your neighborhood? Feel free to just send those in the chat. And Soph, I'm going to go back. Was it What Strange Paradise? Is that the one that you're asking about? Okay, great. This is actually a local author. Omar Lakkad is a Portland-based author, and we listened to some of his podcasts in this class. So the Without podcast, so the phosphorus episode, and I think we listened to another episode. That's Omar Lakkad. Okay, so thoughts on what are some ways that you and I can build community? Okay. And as those are coming in, here are some ways that research and just like historical data that we have on community building shows that we can make kind of specific changes to build community. So creating spaces for community to connect, right? And interestingly, the digital world provides us a lot of these spaces, but there's also physical spaces that we can connect. So thinking about maybe attending a neighborhood meeting or a city meeting, or maybe connecting with folks online. We had a resource previously in this class about buy nothing groups and neighborhood groups where there are sharing groups, right? Where just folks can just connect with one another within their physical locality, okay? Um, that is the seed. And if it's done well, then we can continue through some of these other steps, right? And as you're thinking through what you might do in your own community space, don't feel like you need to take all of these steps all at once. Think about what are a couple of action items that you can do to make a spider web, right? To make a network that helps, folks engage and connect and build, okay? Um, Mapping and aggregating assets. So this link here is actually a GIS application, like steps for a GIS application where you can go in and literally just map out like where is the library, where are folks that have this skill, where are folks that have this skill, right? And you can physically map, just like at the beginning of our discussion, we had a link that maps some of the inequities. Well, we can backtrack that and we can physically map some of those points of resilience. I see some notes coming in the chat, so I'm going to encourage us to engage in that for a minute. Respecting each other, working together, listening to each other, right? Very important. More inviting to neighbors, right? Yeah, just saying hello to one another. Sometimes people are surprised. They're like, what? Oh, hello. Right? So that's another, yeah, absolutely. Engaging in local markets or community spaces that already exist. Absolutely. So I really appreciate this, Ollie. Like we sometimes feel it feels awkward, right? But just practicing a very simple greeting, right? Spreading the greeting between folks and engaging folks in a way that they at least know each other's faces is a really important first step. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And so that allows us to know who we might communicate with or be in community with. And then we can move through. Once we know them, we know their skill sets, right? And we can engage with those folks in our community. Building relationships with folks, right? So having potlucks, right? Engaging folks in your neighborhood, meeting with people at local events and building those relationships. Take down somebody's number. After you take down their number, send them a hello, this is my name. Great to meet you text, right? Maybe 3 months later, they'll remember that they want some connection with you, right? And that's meaningful. Mobilizing resources and sharing. So creating spaces for sharing. So the buy nothing discussion that we had, little free libraries, community potlucks and events. We're going to talk a little bit about seed saving, which we had mentioned at the beginning of today's lecture. So how can we mobilize resources and sharing? And so earlier in the term, we had a TED Talk on mobilizing physical material resources within community rather than creating and generating them new, right? So just even moving up, oh, I have an office chair, you don't need to buy a new office chair, and mobilizing that in a grander scale in your community as well. Then once you are in community with folks, then there might be a step where folks can start to create shared vision. And there's very human level shared visions that we all have. And so starting with those and building up and networking and connecting is really important. And then also thinking about networking and connecting with other communities, right? So maybe you have neighborhood potlucks, but then you also have buy nothing share events, right? Which is just a slightly larger geographic location. And then you're also meeting with folks at the library, which is a slightly larger geographic location. Maybe you're connecting with folks in a place where you live, but then you work in a different place and you're connecting with those folks as well. Making those connections between very small communities makes us all more resilient also. Okay. Um, and so I just listed some ideas here. I'm also going to add some links. I think there are some really great examples that we can add in here too. Micro lending, eco villages, community currencies, some really cool examples of how folks in their communities have started to make structural change that can then branch out. So stay tuned. I'll add some links here. And really going back to this piece about diversity being a strength. So engage, we already said that there are folks that are going to feel the impacts of climate change before those of us who are more privileged, right? It is in our benefit to learn their stories, to learn the impacts, and to learn how they have already had to learn to deal with those impacts. There are already folks that are dealing with rising sea levels. There are already folks that are dealing with air quality issues. There are already folks that are dealing with all of these issues that we anticipate coming with climate change, coming with global warming, even if I, as a person, haven't experienced all of them yet. So engaging in those communities. I love this quote. We are not drowning, we are fighting. We talk a lot about island communities when we talk about rising sea level, but the way that they talk about themselves is very different. And so engaging in those communities those communities themselves, not like an academic study of those communities themselves builds us up and makes us more resilient. This is also a local author, A Tree of My Own. I was in tears at the end of, it's just a children's book, but it's a story of a refugee family and how they, had planted trees in their culture, so on and so forth, and then had moved over. Um, and how they re-engaged with trees in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. This book is written by a local author. And so just like a beautiful example of resilience, and we have those examples in our community, and we need to engage with those stories and with those skill sets, and really uplift those skill sets because they're going to be part of our resilience as a whole. Okay. There was this image here on ideas for how to build community. So I engaged that here as well. And just a couple of examples. I know we need to get to our discussion. Thinking about resilience, remember we said thinking about resilience at chronic but also acute points of change. So thinking about building community, but also thinking about in the Pacific Northwest, if we experience this earthquake that is projected, right? Are we ready as communities to support one another? And so Taryn Oakley, who is my mentor for teaching this class, she has this PCC Ready Bag Community Resilience Project where they engage in thinking about disaster preparedness as a community as well. And so the events for those Ready Bags for this year are finished, but look forward to the fall term. And there's some information and links here for when we actually aggregate and start to develop these ready bags together. And there are some free bags and supplies available to students as well. Okay. Um, and then coming back to seeds, which is how we opened this discussion, I wanted to also close this discussion on seeds. Um, the act of community seed saving is really, really profound. Because what seed saving suggests is not just one person growing one plant, right? What seed saving suggests is a forethought and a production of food beyond just an individual. And so thinking about also that connection of the person to the land, but also the connection of a person potentially to a different land if they are in flux, if they are migrating either autonomously or forced in their migration, right? And thinking about how those seeds and those plants connect folks to one another, give them the autonomy and the skills to feed themselves, but also the ability to move and take those food sources with them. And so I have an article around how you might seed save, and then also some seed sharing and little free seed library article as well. Um, and I wanted to end again on this same image that we had started with and bring kind of all of those ideas together in that we create community together, but also there are structures that ebb and flow, that push potential disasters that might bring us into different community or might erode our ability and capacity to be adaptable and transformable within the communities that we choose. And what are the small actions that we can take, even at the most difficult moments, and how we can learn from folks that have already experienced these stories that are around us all the time, right? And how we can engage in building community and resilience together because we absolutely need that for each of us to be able to be adaptable within a world that is changing, within climate change, global warming, so on and so forth. And so re-engaging in these stories, in these connections. And I do recommend Farming While Black is an amazing book because it's not just about farming and it's not just about community and it's not just about being a minority. It's a book that really pulls together so many different points. And I would really recommend you taking more information from that source. I know we read one chapter, but there's much more to learn. And I have to close this out because I also have to get us to our discussion. So questions, thoughts, um, about our discussion today. Okay, great, great. So, okay. And so the two tips that I have for us today are from Food Rules, do your eating at a table. And so, do your eating at a table and try not to eat alone. No, a desk is not a table, first of all. If we eat while we're working or while we're watching TV or driving, we eat mindlessly. And as a result, we eat more than we would if we were eating at a table, paying attention to what we're doing. This phenomena can be tested and put to good use. Place a child in front of a television and set a bowl of fresh veggies in front of him or her. The child will eat everything in the bowl, often even veggies that they don't ordinarily eat, without noticing what's going on, which suggests an exception to the rule. When eating somewhere other than a table, stick to fruits and vegetables. So the second tip for today is decolonize your diet from the Food Activist Handbook. So, um, the desire to reclaim traditional foods is spreading across the country. Liz Calvo, a professor, gardener, and food activist in Oakland, California, recently began a similar Decolonize Your Diet project in California, aimed at promoting the heritage foods of the area. And I will add that as you decolonize your diet, make sure not to appropriate other folks' foods in that process. Okay. Um, that's what I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for the amazing discussions, and contributions. I really appreciate everyone's engagement today. And next week, we will be talking about energy and transportation. So I look forward to your reflections on that. And just a reminder, sorry, I'm looking at my schedule. That's why I disappear for a second. Just a reminder that we have our sustainability model project coming up. So any questions about the projects, let me know. I'm going to be here for the next couple minutes. Also, feel free to send me an email and kind of just start to think about that as we move forward. So thank you so much, and I will see you all next week.